Well, hello to all our listeners. We've decided to call you our Finding Our Way Throughers. This is Heather, Hope, and Heidi back with you again. If you haven't listened to the short introduction that we created that explains the reason for how our podcast evolved, yeah, we're calling that Podcast Zero. I know it's so original, LOL. Please do so when you get a chance. And if you don't want to go back and listen, no worries. You don't have to. What we want you to know, though, is that the podcast evolved out of a desire to share our own attempts to navigate life's complexities with one another, and in the process, try to offer encouragement, empathy, and understanding along the way so that we could help each other find our way through. And as you listen, that's our hope for you. So, having said that, welcome to our first official podcast.
Yay! Yay!
Today, we'll be talking about something unique to us and to others who share the experience of being born as part of a sibling set. So, sibling sets greater than two, right? Like twins, triplets, quadruplets, not singletons. And hopefully, that's the right term I'm using for just one child born instead of two or three. No more than one, okay? And if that's wrong, listeners, let us know. So, as identical triplets, we're going to be talking about what it was like for the three of us growing up, as I said earlier. The good parts, the parts that are real hard. I'll say the good, the bad, and the ugly. But before we start, it's important to say some things. First, when you listen, you'll realize that our voices sound really similar. So, as we speak, we're going to do our best to differentiate our voices from each other. And then, second, we wanted you to keep in mind that as we talk about what it was like for us growing up, we're doing so from the point of view of our adult selves at 54, looking back upon the experiences of our younger selves, how we remember the experience and how that past today influences our present ones as part of a sibling set. And it's also important to say that we know that there are going to be some redundancies because some of what we say, will have moments of, oh my gosh, yes, me too. So thank you for bearing with the overlap when it surfaces. And then the last thing I want to say is before starting, you need to know something about our backstory. Our parents had 10 children, of which the three of us were the last. So we were numbers 8, 9, and 10. And when we talk about what it was like growing up, keep in mind that context. It's hard to separate our experience growing up as triplets from our experience growing up as triplets in a big family. It's honestly too hard to parse out. And here's a note to family members listening. We absolutely love you. We're so grateful for the family that we've grown up in. We loved mom and dad. We're so thankful for them. We were kept warm and well fed. And
For
at the
sure.
same time, we're sharing first person perspectives, and in no way is there any intent to hurt, harm, or rupture our relationships with you in this process. We know everyone has a way of perceiving, receiving, interacting, experiencing, feeling that's unique to them. So please know that these are our experiences and ours alone. From a clinical social work perspective, I know a lot about family systems and family dynamics. They are real and they're hard to navigate at times. And lastly, I think for the three of us sharing, it's really cool because the podcast is giving us a chance to connect in a way that we haven't really done throughout our adult lives, because I think we spent the bulk of our adult lives running from the fact that we were triplets. So, having said that, Heath and Hope, is there anything else you feel like I missed and that you'd like to add?
Heidi, I think you said it all. And, just a quick note to our family. We love you all.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would jump on that bandwagon. I'm super grateful for everything that we were given as kids. Every one of our needs was met, most definitely. And I think for the three of us, what you'll hear as we kind of go through our experience is that, as Heidi just said, we were all navigating on our own to find our own paths. And so, yeah, I think this should be a good conversation. Awesome, guys. Thanks. And so, well, let's get started. I thought it would be kind of fun to have us start by thinking about this. Are you ready?
Yep. Ready.
Okay, so as you remember back on your life, if you had to use one word to describe your experience growing up as an identical triplet, what would that one word be, do you think?
Hopi?
Heather, you want to start or?
Go for it, Hopi.
I think looking back with my perspective now, the one word I would use would be emotional. There, and what I mean by that is, there were highs and there were lows, happy times and challenging times. So I think the word that I would use to describe my experience, at least, growing up as a triplet in a larger family, in a larger family context, it was emotional. Yeah, that is a great word, I think, and absolutely describes what you just said. So awesome. Heath, what about you?
Well, I too think that emotional is a great word because it is so 150% true. A lot of highs and a lot of lows. And I think it's an interesting question, Hyde, because one word to describe it is a challenge. Because I think if I look at it, um, there are two words that come to mind for me, and the first one is blessing, and the second one is complex. And I'll talk more about that as we move through this podcast. And I think my 54-year-old self today, looking back on our shared life together, I would use the word blessing.
Okay, awesome.
What about you, Hyde? What's your word?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I love the words you guys chose. Um, when I thought about that before I asked you that question, the word that came to mind was different.
Mm,
And so what I mean by that is like in some ways different was good because I knew that our, experience was not the same as our friends who, of course, didn't have a triplet sister. Um, but then in other ways, different to me means strange. And I say that because when we were growing up, we got so much attention. And I'm not so sure I liked the attention.
mm.
Um, People always wanting to take our picture. I don't know if you guys remember that, but people would stop us and say, "Oh my gosh, you're identical triplets, can I take your picture?" And so sometimes I think my more sensitive self interpreted that like we're, some carnival sideshow.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, just in
Yeah.
terms of, feeling like you're a sideshow at a circus as a kid. And I'm sure it didn't help that mom dressed us in the identical clothing until we were like, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old, until we finally put up our hands and said, "Wait, this isn't cool. Like our sameness is cool as kids, but as we got older, it wasn't so much so." So, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, I think as a kid, you look at those instances and you think, this is strange, this is not normal. And then as our 54-year-old selves looking back, you start to think that's so interesting. They just must have thought that it was cool or unique. And to your earlier
word different. They weren't used to seeing three cute girls that looked exactly the same. So
Right.
yeah, it's been a different experience.
And I definitely think that's true because remember, we were growing up as kids in the early 70s. And so if you think about identical triplets, we were very rare, right? There were no fertility drugs back then. And with mom having had 7 children prior to us, the notion of fertility drugs would have been, way out of the ballpark. But I do think that there was this sort of fascination with us as kids.
I agree with that 100%. And
Yeah,
I
and like
think
you
to
guys
this
said,
day, sorry, Had, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I think, and like from an adult perspective now looking back, I can totally appreciate that. But I think as a younger person trying to figure out and navigate, those experiences, I don't know, it felt kind of, I don't, just, it made me feel
Strange.
Less than.
different. Yeah. Yeah.
like
And
like
not
you
so
know
much
you
less
know
than,
it,
but
I
just
think of
different.
I don't mean to interrupt Ty too, but I do think like if you guys remember when we were young, I think we were walking to school or home from school one day, and a group of boys were following us, calling us clones, right? And you think about that as a kid, and you don't really even understand what a clone is, but you don't like the word, and you kind of
Hmm.
do know that it means you're the exact same. You're not different at all, and it's hurtful as a kid. Um, but again, part of the blessing is that I refer to as just as even if you're experiencing that trauma, my 54-year-old self can look back and say, "Well, thankfully, I didn't have to experience that trauma alone."
Yeah, that's a good point, Had. I think the word clone to your point really does infer sameness. And even when someone would refer to us as kids, I mean, you guys remember when we would be anywhere in our hometown and we would run into someone, and they would not say our names. They would say, "Hi, triplet."
Mm.
And to me, saying "Hi, triplet" was the same as saying clones,
Right.
just having it infer that there was this sameness. And yes, physically, we look very similar, but it kind of takes away from the independent individual self. And so, yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, when we talk about some of the things that were challenging for the three of us, because we
Yeah, and I
probably
think
feel a
on
little bit the same there.
I think on some level too, it implies sort of a level of disrespect, right? And or as a little kid, when somebody is not referring to you by your name, right? It tends to imply that, well, maybe you're not like worthy enough for me to want to know your name, right? Even though we did look a lot alike, right? We're identical triplets and we sound similar. Um, it can
Yeah.
still be it can still be a bit hurtful.
Or I don't care enough about you to learn your name.
Exactly.
Good point.
Well, so I hear emotional, I hear blessing and complex, I hear different. I mean, don't you guys think it's neat to consider that we all had different words to explain the experiences within the same context? It's really cool, isn't it?
Yes, I think really cool. Um, Even though some of those sort of infer, in a way, similar experiences, because I think all three of us probably viewed being a part of a trio or unit. We were a connected unit. Um, and we were sort of facing life together, even though we were experiencing the community a little bit differently, interpreting how the community perceived us. Um, so yeah, I think it's fascinating.
All right, well, guys, thanks for that. Thanks for taking some time to think about a word that you felt like could describe it. And I know, like you said, it was hard to do it, but good job. Um, so why don't we start talking about what was good? I know you mentioned some things, but Hope, why don't you start telling us what was good for you about being a triplet?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think. the things that were good, well, first of all, it's funny when you think about being a triplet. We never knew anything different, right? We were born at 4 minutes apart from each other. We were always together. We always had each other, and that, to Heather's earlier word, was a blessing. So I think part of being triplets, some of the good things about that was we always had a built-in friend, right? We
Yeah,
were
definitely.
we didn't have to show up to school by ourselves. We didn't have to be in a schoolyard on our own looking for friends. We didn't have to show up to a sporting event on our own. We always had each other, and there was, I think for me, an inherent strength that I felt in that. I always felt like, maybe the three of us were a little bit of a force,
It is a
because
bit empowering. You're right.
yeah, like I felt as though I wasn't alone. And I think for me, that was special, and, you know, made me feel good about the three of us being this unit. But I think it was just for the probably the best thing for me was that I always had two built-in friends.
Do you have other things that you feel like were good before Heather shares?
Heather, why don't you go ahead and talk about what you thought was good, and I'll come back as I think about it.
Yeah, Hopi, thanks so much. And I think it goes back to, you know, your first point before talking about what was good, right? And that term is, it was really unique, right? And to Hyde's point about different, because we were born in the world together as a unit. And so, the uniqueness is that we had each other, right? We never had to worry about finding friends, because no matter what was happening to us, we always had each other. And, obviously, as we move through life, the complex part of our relationship starts to impact that unit as we all search for independence. But for me, I would say, you know, what's good about it is you guys, right? I mean, I have two amazing people, right by my side, um, who I know no matter what, you know, even back then growing up, you always had my back. Today, when I'm feeling, alone, I'm never really truly alone because I know if I need you guys, you would be there in a heartbeat.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, to this day, I feel really blessed knowing that I have you. And again, having grown up in a large family, right? It's navigating the complexities of growing up in a large family. So, I can't imagine going through my life without you guys, really. Um, and I believe again that being part of a triplet, of a multiple experience, it is so rare. It is so rare, and I just feel really thankful for it.
What about you, Hyde?
Yeah, I mean, this is again where I think we're having to ask our listeners to um, listen to some redundancies because absolutely what the both of you guys said, I would say for sure was true for me too. That sense of connection with one another. I mean, I always had somebody to play with. I always had somebody to walk to school with. I always had somebody to talk to when, another friend of ours like may have hurt my feelings. There was never really a time where I felt like I was ever really alone.
Yeah.
Um, and like that's an experience that's just hard to find, I think, if you're a singleton, I guess is the word that we were using earlier. So there's a uniqueness like Heather talked about that, it's hard for other people to really understand who haven't had the opportunity to have the experience that we have. Um, so like in one sense, I think we spent so much time together that it was hard to kind of know where we started and where we ended. There was
Great
such a
point.
blending between the three of us. And of course, as we got older, I think we started to feel the need to separate. But like our younger selves before we were like middle school, high school, I think for the most part it was all good. And honestly, it was the only thing that like we knew.
Exactly.
We didn't know anything different, you know? So that's what I would say about what was good about it. And carrying that forward to today, again, some overlap. If I am in, need of anything, I know without a doubt you guys will be there. If I call you or text you, I know I'm going to get an immediate response, and I just feel like I have access to support and encouragement, or like a shoulder to cry on, whatever it is. So um, yeah, it goes back to that blessing, or I guess gift, that I think we've been given as triplets.
Yeah, I hear you talking about this bond and asking our listeners to be patient. I don't know if either of you remembers at my rehearsal dinner before I got married. I remember standing up and talking about each of the individuals that were a part of my wedding party. And when it got to the two of you, I became somewhat emotional. And I just remember saying to everyone that was in the room, and that was, people that we all love, our family, our friends, a whole host of others, that I was trying to explain the two of you. And I remember saying that it's really hard to understand what it was like to be a triplet. Just like with anything in life, if you haven't had the experience of it, it's hard to imagine what it's like. And, I keep going back to never feeling alone, always having a friend there, knowing that we were loved no matter what, having two people always be there to support and protect. We use the word, someone who always had your back no matter what. And I don't know if you remember our family used to say when the three of us would see each other. So this is when we were little, or as we were going through high school or college, or when we would come back together for a family event, where they would say that we were having our triplet talk,
Yeah,
meaning
yeah.
that, like, that quiet protective environment that only the three of us could understand,
Yeah.
because we were that connected. And it is hard, like it is hard to explain to others what it is like to go through your life being connected with your sibling pair. For us, it's that we were identical triplets, um, and I just think it was really a very cool and special way to grow up, because we didn't know any different. But there were definitely some challenging things about it too, which I know we'll get to. But
Well,
do
that's
you remember
actually,
the do you guys remember the triplet talk? And
Oh
um,
gosh, I mean, we've talked about when we were talking about naming this podcast, triplet talk was thrown out as an option too. But, Hope, just to your point before we move on too, I think and back to Heidi's, initial question about a word that describes it, I think special could be one of those words too. But um, for our kids, now that we're parents and we've had to navigate, being parents and helping our kids through so many different situations in their lives. But, I remember when Farah, to all of our listeners, she's my oldest child, when she was a little kid, she was having, some issues with friend groups. And, I actually felt for the first time that it was difficult for me to relate because I never had to really worry in a situation where there were issues with friend groups because I always had you guys, and so
yeah.
again, that goes to maybe one of the challenges about being a triplet, right? It's you and again, Hope, back to your point, like you don't really know something unless you sort of stood in those shoes. And being a triplet, for anyone that's not in a multiple uh, set, it's hard to understand what it's really like, and then to relate to others who are not can be challenging.
Yeah. Well, I know you guys, I've heard you say a couple times, you know, what some of the challenges have been or could be. So why don't we go ahead and segue into that actually? Had maybe you want to start talking about what some of the challenges were for you growing
Sure,
up?
sure. And I think it's challenges, and then part of the complexity too. So I think when you're young, and back to the point of, mom dressing us in the same clothes till we were ridiculously old age, um, that, you know, as a kid, you really appreciate the sameness, right? That sameness, until you move into, I would say, your preteen or your teen years, when you really are developing more of a sense of self and wanting to be your own person, and not always wanting to be known as one of the triplets, right? Because again, it goes back to what we had talked about earlier. When, I think that you're one of the triplets, it can be upsetting when folks don't take the time, to get to know you, get to know your name, and, an attempt to understand kind of like who you are as a person. And I think at that stage of development, you know, and I'm sure you guys, were sort of all thirsting for your own identity, right? And so we all started wearing different clothing, and then started to become a bit more competitive with one another. And that's an important part of the complexity of the relationship, right? Because I don't think there was outright competition in its truest form. But I know for me personally, I became a lot more focused on not wanting to be, the least attractive, the least unathletic, the least intelligent triplet, right? And I think it is a very natural part of what you can call sibling rivalry. But I think when you're an identical triplet, you might experience sibling rivalry a little bit on steroids. So I think, you know, that being competitive part was the challenging part, I think, in the complex part of the relationship for me. Um, you know, I think interestingly too, throughout our youth, for me, we always had the same group of friends, right? And, our BFFs, shout out to the BFFs. Um,
Go BFFs.
yeah. And, we all played the same sports, and we were all academically competitive with one another. But I think for me, part of that identity, right, was what sort of propelled me to want to go to a different college, from you guys, because it was that sense of self that I was looking for, really. And so the, the challenging part of the relationship for me was really, I think, always this thirsting and thriving to establish your own identity or sense of self. Um,
Well, and can I just, you know, jump in for a sec?
Of course, yeah.
Please.
So I would say that, our sense of self is always developing from the time that we're born, but we hit a certain stage, right? Like Murray Bowen is a family systems theorist, and he talks about this thing called individuation, which is what you're talking about, Heather. It's you get to a point in time where, you have this need to know who you are apart from who other people are from your family or from your parent, your mother, your father. And, I think for us, it wasn't just navigating, trying to figure out who we were apart from our parents, close relationships to us, but each other, where, you started and ended, where Hope started and ended, where I started and ended.
Hmm.
And so what you're talking about is something that people go through from a developmental perspective. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely something that was challenging for you, and hope I'm sure you would say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, right? I mean, being placed in the sameness bucket was always a pretty significant challenge for me, and I know for the two of you as well. We got to a place where we rebelled pretty hard against the sameness thinking,
Hmm.
just with, all looking the same and having waist length hair and deciding on a whim that I was going to chop off all of my hair and come home and think that everybody would have a great response to it. I think
Do you remember how old you were when that happened?
well, it, would have gotten my hair cut in Marblehead, so probably like, I don't know, early teens maybe.
Okay.
Um,
High school, definitely high school, right?
yeah, maybe freshman year in high
Yeah.
school where, I went and got my hair cut from waist length to literally like a pixie.
Yeah.
Um,
Pretty radical, right?
it was, I,
It was like
but I
spiked,
think
yes.
as I think back on it, I was just trying to establish my independence and trying to tell the rest of the community that we grew up in that even though we were part of triplets, we were each still individuals. And I think I was trying to have myself be recognized as that. I think the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and we talked about it so far in terms of what was good about it, we always did have built in friends. We always had each other to lean on. The two of you guys were always by my side. I think one of the challenges for me, though, as I started to kind of figure out who I was around friendships and how to actually develop strong friendships because I think because I always had the two of you and I didn't have to try very hard, it was a challenge for me to actually try and understand how to be a good friend. And I just remember certain examples of, being in high school or college, and one in particular. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I just remember one of our friends was having a hard time in college, and she asked me to meet her at the Driftwood for breakfast, and I was like, of course, I'll be there as soon as possible, and didn't know that she was just looking for one of us to come. And I think I said, "Hey guys, let's go grab breakfast." So the three of us went and talked to this friend of ours. And it didn't dawn on me until a couple of days later when she said, "It's always so great for all of you to be here, but I really just wanted to talk to you." And that was the first time that I sort of thought like, "Huh, that's really interesting." I was putting you and Heather and Heidi into the same. She called and wanted to do something, so naturally the three of us should go as opposed to just me going.
Right.
So
You
and I
became us.
me I yes I became us, like, it wasn't just me, it was we. So that's a pretty that was pretty dramatic for me. That was like one of those things where I was like, huh,
Mm.
that's right. Well, I can be a friend to one person independent of the two of you. So the sameness thing, I think, struggling to really become a good friend outside of the context of always knowing that no matter what, you were there, like that you actually have to try in a friendship. You have to, reach out. And so that was a challenge. And yeah, too, I mean, this innate competition that I don't know if the competition would have been as strong if it were just the three of us with no outside perspective. But I always felt like others were constantly comparing us, whether it was teachers, whether it was coaches, whether it was family members.
That's a
um,
great point.
I think that
Hmm.
the way that I perceived others was that they were constantly comparing, and I think because of the comparisons, it drove this competitive nature among the three of us. The one thing that I regret to this day is that the three of us didn't talk about that, though. I think we all sort of tried to internalize that and move through that to find our own way through it without talking about it. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Heather said. Heidi, the whole idea of individuation and getting to a point where like, you need to go on your own path and sort of find your own find
Yeah.
your own trajectory. But the one thing that really does stand out for me was that actually understanding that you have to try and be there and create friendships. Heather, something you said earlier about, your daughter struggling with friend groups when she was younger. I remember having the exact same sense when my daughter was trying out for a sports team, and we got to the tryout, and she was like, I don't know anybody here. And I at that point I was like, wow, I've never experienced that because I always had Heather or Heidi with me. So it's those little nuggets, the things that I remember from my past, and then the things that are sprinkled in my life now that bring me back to this connection that we had, that made it easy for us to go through the earlier part of our life, um, and maybe a little bit harder when we were each trying to find our own individual paths. And so, yeah, those are my challenges. Hyde, what about you?
Before I talk about my challenges, I have a question for you guys.
Yeah,
So, okay, so do you remember the outfit that you first wore when you could make, your own choice? Like, I think it was fifth grade that mom stopped dressing us alike. Do you guys remember at all what you wore? I totally remember what I wore.
tell us what you wore because
Tell
I
us
don't
what you
remember.
wore.
I don't remember what I wore.
I don't remember yesterday, much less the outfit I wore in fifth grade.
Okay, so at the
But I would
time,
love to know what you wore.
remember those shirts that were really popular? Like, I think they were rugby shirts with the little rubber buttons on them.
Oh
Yes,
yeah,
with the
stripes.
stripes.
Yes, with the stripes. So
Yeah.
it was like a white and orange striped rugby shirt, like short sleeve, with like kind of like yellowish chinos and a pair of brown clogs.
No wide wheel corduroys.
No, not a
The
ton.
yellow
No
wide
wearing
wheel
Oh,
corduroys.
turtlenecks.
I thought
They're a
I looked so
specialty in our
good.
closets.
I was so excited to express my own fashion statement. Like, okay, this is my choice and I look good.
Oh, I wish we had a picture of that. It would have
I
been so
know.
great if someone took a picture of us on our first day of school without
Yeah.
having to wear the same clothes. I don't remember how. Do you remember?
I don't. I honestly don't remember what I
Oh,
wore,
that's a
but I'm
bummer. You guys
sure.
don't
I'm
I
sure it
remember.
know it
was.
is a bummer. I wish I did.
I'm
I
sure I look
remember what
really
I had
cool.
on at different points in my life, but for whatever reason, I don't remember that day.
Yeah. That says
No,
something though, right? Like
It
it's
does
not
say
that
something.
clearly in my mind, like freedom, sort of, in a sense.
identity. Finally, identity.
Yeah.
Um, and Hyde, before you start, I just wanted to say one thing, just to go back to Hope, what she was just saying previously in terms of challenge in friends too. I remember one thing that was probably one of the most humbling things for me when I went to college, and I went to college at a different school than you guys, and I was so incredibly homesick, and I was so jealous of the fact that you guys were at the same school together. And to add insult to injury, your roommates were twins, Eli and Christine. And, I remember feeling just so sad. And then we had to go to, sort of like freshman orientation, and I had to sit in a circle, with people who I did not know and actually have a conversation. And I remember saying, like, hey, everybody, I'm Heather. And, it was the first time I didn't say, I remember this so well. I didn't say I'm an identical triplet,
As a way
because,
to introduce
be,
yourself.
yes, because I wanted to be Heather. So anyway, I just thought that that was an important point to pull up. And again, it talks about the complexity of the relationship. But I would love, Hyde, for you to talk to us about what was challenging from your end.
I think probably for me, again, this is a 54-year-old adult thinking back on the experience growing up. And I think it had a lot for me to do with not only the fact that I was the youngest triplet, right?
Even though we were
Mhm.
4 minutes apart,
Even though we were
Yeah.
exactly.
four minutes
Right.
apart.
You're the baby of the family, technically.
Yeah. Um, I was treated that way by the family as the youngest, as the baby. And so I think the thing that has been most challenging for me is just overcoming ideas and beliefs about myself that got generated along the way because of the experience that I had.
Hmm.
And because I can really remember, like, I remember playing softball town softball with you guys, and they
Shout
put
out to
me.
the Wharf Rats.
Yes, oh my
Go
gosh,
Wharf Rats.
that was a
Best team
great
ever.
memory. Oh my gosh, I forgot the name of our team, but yeah, I think that was the first softball team that we played on, right?
Yep.
Um, but I remember being very aware of my lack of confidence. And I'm not sure if that was like nature or nurture, like something happened in the environment that made me feel like I wasn't as good at or skilled at, softball as you guys were. And I think probably I was also a little chunky at that time. And I know people don't really use that word anymore. Um, we talk about having healthy body images and eating healthy food. And,
Hmm.
the FAT word is not used, but back in the day, you better bet it was. Um, so yeah, so I think I was very aware of or conscious of who I was and how I was in comparison to you guys. And, you know, and again, I don't know if that was true for the two of you, but it was for me. And so I think that, feeling like I'm not as good of an athlete or I don't know, not as thin
Competent
as
or
or yeah, I mean, competent comes up as an adult. I don't think it did so much as a younger kid. I mean, academically, I think it was more sports related. But yeah, I mean, I think if I'm being honest, that's how it has impacted me. Like that's been sort of the greatest challenge for me to overcome in my adult life is kind of trying to understand what it was that made me think that that was true, what what I came to believe about myself, and again, without really a complete and total awareness, because again, it's hard for kids to have the ability to think in an abstract kind of way. Like when
right.
you're young, it's very concrete. It's, they're better at this than I am. And sometimes that's true, but it's not always true. It's just the way that I was perceiving it or experiencing it. So I don't know if you guys can relate to anything that I'm saying, but yeah. And in terms of the friend stuff, I think absolutely learning that you have to put effort into building friendships. We didn't really have to do that because we always had built-in friends.
Yep.
So that, of course, is something that I've had to learn along the way. Um, yeah, I can't think of anything popping up, just coming to mind in right now. But
So, Heidi, it's interesting that, well, what I think is interesting is that even though we were born 4 minutes apart, Heather was first. I came 4 minutes after Heather, and Heidi, you were 4 minutes after me. Even though we were all born on the same day, very close to one another from a time perspective, we were, in a way, treated by our family members as that Heather was the oldest, I was the middle child, and Heidi was the youngest.
mhm,
Even though we were the end of 10 kids, we were still treated, and our personalities sort of took on Heather the oldest, Hope the middle, Heidi the youngest. And so for you to have those feelings about not measuring up, for me, the way that that translated in my brain was that no one cared about me, that everybody thought that because I was the middle child, I could just take care of myself. And so, what that did to me, the impact it had on me was to make me not want to rely on anybody. I
Mm,
think for me, even to this day, I still struggle with um, asking people to help me because I
mhm,
think I went through life with our family thinking that I could just take care of things on my own.
yeah.
And, but the way that I perceived that was that we don't care about her. She can take care of herself. So emotionally, I felt like I was sort of out on an island alone with no one caring about me. I know that's not true. To this day, I feel like we had a lot of love in our lives. I mean, mom gave us tons of love, dad the same. Our siblings, I think, were fascinated by the fact that we were triplets. But the way that everyone chose to treat us was as the oldest, the middle, and the baby. And I think when you're treated that way, you sort of it goes back to your nature versus nurture
Mhm.
question. Was it inherent, or were we this way because of the way that we were treated by those that were closest to us? So I think that the fact that you brought that up is fascinating because, again, I always I always just felt like they all were like, you'll make your way in life. But the way that I took that wasn't like a confidence in what I could do. It was more we don't really care. You can kind of just get through. And I know that sounds nonsensical, but I think that's the way I interpreted it. And so to this day, still, I'm like, no, no, I can do it by myself. I have a very hard time asking for help when I need help, and when getting help would be much better for me. And I'm learning that about myself, and I'm trying to kind of overcome that today. But I also, and Heidi, you can agree with this or not, um, I always kind of did feel like because Heather was treated as the oldest, she sort of mothered or looked after you and me. Heather, I don't know how you feel about that. Heidi, I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, sorry, Hyde, if you want to go, please do.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's I've always sort of felt, a little bit motherly on some level. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember when we were little, even, crossing streets, I was always so fearful that someone was going to get hit by a car, and I was always asking, did you look both ways before you crossed the street? Just like a mom would do. But I do question, the nature versus nurture, because I do think that we for sure were Heather, Hope, and Heidi, right? And it's it's how our family treated us and the dynamic. Now, the things that I remember, and I think your points are so valid, because I just really feel like as a child, it was more of I was just trying to survive, and it's not so much in our dynamic, but I think it was just part of being in a larger family,
Yeah,
and
totally.
everybody sort of set these expectations for who you are or you were supposed to be, and I just always remember feeling like we were being compared to one another, right? And it's like this.
Unspoken comparison.
Yeah,
Unspoken.
and
Yeah,
it's
It
that's
was
a
like
good
this.
always
word.
kind of covert.
Yeah, and you're always, then it becomes this sort of fight for survival, and, at some point finding your independence and proving to people that, you know, you can do whatever you put your mind to. But it is a really interesting dynamic. And it for sure, as you and Hope both said, it's that perception that you have of yourself. And for me too, to this day, it's very difficult for me to ask for help when asking for help would be the easiest and best thing for me. And I think, again, not to go back to the family dynamic, but, we did lose dad, when we were 13 years old. And again, that instinctual fight for survival when we're little kids carried over on steroids, right? When you find yourself in a situation where, oh my gosh, you're in eighth grade and you have all of this, quote, life stuff coming at you, and you have to navigate that environment with no dad, right? And so, um, yeah, it's complex. It goes back to the complexity part of, how we initially started the conversation as well. But Hyde, I didn't mean to cut you off, so please. Um,
No, you didn't cut me off. I think your comments are all great. I think they're awesome. And um, yeah, and I think our listeners can really get just how complex it is trying to navigate or find our way through being identical triplets or being a part of a sibling set. It's just a different experience than people who don't have the same one.
Yeah, I'm going back to finding our way through, finding our way through or navigating through being triplets, trying to find our way to our individual selves. And as we get older, finding our way not through but back to this connection that we all share and the desire to want to know each other more now than probably ever before.
Hmm.
I think is pretty special. I know that's a complete side aside from what we were just talking about, but I just felt compelled to say that because when you were saying finding your way through, those were the thoughts that came to my mind in conjunction with what Heather said about, surviving. We had a lot of things happen to us when we were, younger kids with a dad passing and, as we got a little bit older and through college with mom passing, and sort of surviving, getting through life. And Heidi, you were mentioning some of the things earlier about some of the life experiences that we didn't have a chance to have, our parents present at. So this connection through this podcast and being able to talk through it is super special to me.
Yeah.
Complex, but special.
And to your points, I think we had an experience as being identical triplets, like we've talked about, in a large family system. And while we had older siblings to help our parents raise us, really, because, you know, 10 children, I have two, and I can't even imagine what mom's life really truly was like.
And
No.
Heidi, do you want to talk about their ages when when they had us?
Yeah, I'll just say our mom was 47 when she had identical triplets, and our dad was 46. So that is pretty hard to wrap anyone's
Hmm.
head around.
Especially when you have 7 other kids at home.
Yeah, and so in a sense, I think even though there were a whole bunch of us and older siblings to help, really still a lot of our experience was, or the way that I think, you know, we kind of quickly learned to function was very independently. So it's going back to your point about having a hard time asking for help. Um, it was sort of, when we talk about it, it's like, did we have, a parent read a bedtime story to us at night or tell us it's time to brush your teeth? Or, I mean, again, no shame, no blame. It was just, a lot of kids to care for. So I always kind of come back to that song by Taylor Swift where, she says, "You're on your own, kid. You always have been." Not to insult our family members or parents, but I think it's true for them too. I think it's hard for everybody in our family really to ask for help because we really were pretty much raised to be self-sufficient. And that's, it's got pros for sure, a lot of pros, but it's got some cons too.
Yep,
So I don't
excellent
know how that
points.
fits into the context of the conversation, but guys, listen, I know that it's getting late, so there are still some things that I think would be important to talk about in regard to the topic today, finding our way through being triplets.
Yep.
I know we want to add some stuff about what we think we'd like to say to parents who are raising sibling sets today. It's kind of like do's and don'ts based on our experience. Also, to some of the kids that are themselves trying to navigate sibling sets. And so, I think maybe if you guys agree, we will do a second part to this podcast to finish up, the conversation. How's it sound to you, Heather? How's it sound to you, Hope?
I
I think
love that for
yeah,
sure. There's
I
a lot
think it
more to
makes
say.
I think it makes
Okay.
good sense.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks you guys for everything that you shared. I don't know if there's, something you want to say before we end the podcast.
No, I would just say we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast. And Hopi, what about you?
Same thing. We look forward to all of you finding our way through or finding us on our next podcast.
And
Awesome.
remember, how we should end, I'm going to say, remember, everybody listening, you got this.
You got this.
You got this.